Howdy, it's the Bitter Southerner podcast, episode 7 of our second season from Georgia Public Broadcasting and the magazine I edit, The Bitter Southerner. I'm your host, Chuck Reese, and today we're going to travel and maybe even do a little time travel through the Tennessee Valley.
It was down in the valley that's called Tennessee. Uncle Sam started something in the year 33.
The late great Pete Seeger with his song TVA Song.
Saw democracy's future when we built TVA. Now rivers that once ran unchecked to the sea use the force that was wasted for electricity.
Now, what he was singing about, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA as we all call it, was created as part of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal to lift the country out of the Great Depression. Large dams were built to bring electricity to the rural South, to control flooding, to prevent disease, and improve agricultural conditions. And here's President Roosevelt talking all that up in 1940 in Tennessee at the dedication of the Chickamauga Dam.
This Chickamauga Dam, the sixth in the series of mammoth structures built by the TVA for the people of the United States, is helping to give to all of us human control of the watershed of the Tennessee River in order that it may serve in full the purposes of mankind.
Now, these mammoth structures, as the president said, did electrify the rural South, but many were unhappy because that progress uprooted their communities.
There are those who maintain that the development of the enterprise that lies largely in this state, the development of it, they say, is not a proper activity of government. As for me, I glory in it as one of the great social and economic achievements of the United States.
As the Tennessee Valley Authority built dams like the Chickamauga, many communities were flooded. According to TVA data analyzed by Bitter Southerner contributor Micah Cash, some 14,000 families were displaced by dams built by the TVA. The TVA offered to buy their property so they could relocate, and many agreed, but others, like Maddie Randolph, put up a fight. Maddie lived in a small 2-room log cabin with her husband and 7 children, and their property was going to be flooded with the creation of Tennessee's Norris Dam. And according to TVA records, Ms. Randolph threatened several TVA workers with a shotgun, and in one instance said this:
"Well, I'll stay here until the water comes up and flow down with it when it does."
Maddie Randolph obviously did not mince words. She wanted to keep her 14 acres.
They want to beat me out of it? They might as well take it all. I ain't gonna take a cent of it.
In its report, the TVA described Maddie Randolph like this:
"She is a very domineering, tyrannous, blustering soul. Her stubborn, obstinate manner has possibly put up a strong wall to any possible successful contacts. Another problem is the fact that neither she nor her family have any idea as to the meaning of the TVA, why it came in and broke up her community, why they moved her neighbors away, why they closed the gates of the, quote, darn dam and backed the water up over her garden just at the time she wanted to pick her beans. But they didn't fool her, as she said, with her hands on her hips, for she just took her shoes off, waded down in the water, and picked the beans anyway. In her mind, the TVA had ruined a good farming country."
Now, in the end, faced with the prospect of rising waters overcoming her family, Maddie Randolph finally agreed to move. And her story later inspired the great film director Elie Kazan to make his 1960 movie Wild River.
I don't sell my land that I poured my heart's blood into.
In this scene from the film, an elderly woman named Ella Garth vows to protect her land as a TVA administrator urges her to leave.
Sometimes it happens that we can't remain true to our beliefs without hurting maybe a great many people. And I'm afraid this is one of those times. You're the only person who hasn't sold in this valley.
Well, that's all right with me.
That was the late Oscar-winning actress Jo Van Fleet as Ella Garth in Wild River. You know, the classic story of people versus progress, when set in the South of the early 20th century, is typically associated with the TVA. But it is important to note, for historical accuracy, that the federal government actually broke ground on North Alabama's Wilson Dam in 1918, 6 years before the TVA formed, and in 1933, TVA took ownership of it. But regardless of who owned what, how rural Southerners reacted to the dams depended on one thing: whether they were displaced loggers or newly employed dam builders. Now, these stories have fueled works of art from Pete Seeger all the way down to the modern day, like this song by Jason Isbell.
He helped build a dam, gave power to most of the South. So I thank God for the TVA.
Today on the Bitter Southerner podcast, Progress, Heartbreak, and Art, the TVA.
Where Roosevelt let us all work for an honest day's pay. Thank God for the TVA.
And we just heard a little bit of Jason Isbell's song about the TVA, and you probably know the name of Jason Isbell. He's the widely acclaimed singer-songwriter from North Alabama, and he wrote that song during his tenure in the band that plays our theme song, the Drive-By Truckers. Now, and back then, when I first heard Jason's TVA, I was struck by the stark difference there was in point of view between that song and a song written a few years earlier by one of his bandmates, Mike Cooley. Mike's song was called Uncle Frank, and I want you to hear just a little bit of the original from DBT's 1999 album, Pizza Deliverance.
Powered up the city with hydroelectric juice. Now we got more electricity we can't ever use. Flooded out the holler, and all the folks down there moved out. They got paid, so there ain't nothing else to think about.
Cooley's Uncle Frank character was one of those displaced loggers. He didn't have much to thank God for after Wilson Dam flooded his community right there near Muscle Shoals, where Cooley grew up. So I asked Mike to join us for this show to talk about that contrast and to play Uncle Frank for us. Now, Mike wrote that song more than 20 years ago, and when he wrote it, the source, he says, was a story his grandfather told him about a man who lost his home and livelihood thanks to the Wilson Dam. Now, it was precisely the kind of story that would make any young songwriter say, now, I gotta write that. But now Cooley's older, of course, and he knows more, and he never really carried a grudge against what the TVA accomplished. In fact, he says, playing the song these days has him seeing parallels between the days of those floods and the juncture our country is at right now.
I never had a negative impression of anything that TVA accomplished.
Really?
In fact, quite the contrary.
Yeah, and is that still true for you?
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's certain inevitabilities. I think we're at a very similar point now. You know, it's like, you know, the country at the time, it wasn't just about coming out of the Depression and the economy would have recovered, you know, yeah, that's going to happen. But it was about is the country or is the United States going to come out of this on the forefront of the 20th century?
Right.
Or is the rest of the world going to leave us behind? And I think in hindsight, you look back and it's like you couldn't do one without the other.
And here we are at a similar junction again.
I think we're at a very similar place, yeah.
And I think it's probably time to let everybody listen to you play the song. And
okay.
I'm going to say what my daddy used to say before he would lead songs in church. Listen to the words real close now.
Powered up the city with hydroelectric juice. Now we got more electricity than we can ever use. They flooded out the holler and all the folks down there moved out. They got paid so there ain't nothing left to think about. Some of them made their living cutting timber down, sneaking in one log at a time up the hill and into town. The TVA had a way to clear it off real fast. Lots of men and machinery built a dam and drowned the rest. Uncle Frank lived on the bottom, down on Cedar Creek. He bought 15 acres when he got back home from overseas. 15 rocky acres he figured no one else would want. Till all that backed up water had to have some place to go. Uncle Frank couldn't read or write. Never held down a job or needed one in his life. But they assured him there'd be work for him in town, building cars. It's already going down. Cars never came to town and roads never got built. And the price of all their power kept on going straight uphill. And the banks around the holler sold for lakefront property, where doctors, lawyers, and musicians teach the kids to water ski. Uncle Frank couldn't read or write, so there's no note or letter found when he died. Just a rope around his neck and a kitchen table turned on its side.
Damn, son, that was good.
Well, thank you.
That whole song doesn't feel like an old story necessarily. And I particularly think about what's always been my favorite line in it. The banks around the holler sold for lakefront property, where doctors, lawyers, and musicians teach their kids to water ski.
Yeah. Throwing musicians into these elite occupations was a uniquely Muscle Shoals area thing, and a little nod to, I think it may have benefited the lucky and the elite probably a little more than anybody else, but what doesn't, you know?
As you can testify to, we're not that many generations away from stories about people who lost their homes and communities and had their lives changed forever because of the TVA. But at the same time, it was a wonderful thing that the rural South got electricity.
Yeah.
Because that changed things for the positive for everybody.
People do get left behind. You know, you use the phrase, you know, or you hear it often, we have to drag these people kicking and screaming into the modern times, but some people don't make the trip.
That's true.
But, you know, this area, in many ways, I guess at that time, rural was a lot more rural than it is today, but in some ways, it may be more rural today than it was then. I don't know. It's hard for me to tell. That's where the divide is. But this was in the height of the Great Depression. You know, people in those kind of areas didn't really notice. They were poor, underdeveloped before. It's like Reconstruction. What do you mean? Nothing around here was ever constructed much in the first place, you know? And so, yeah, you know, and it, you know, change is not something human beings are wired for, especially fundamental and maybe monumental changes to your entire way of life.
Human beings aren't wired for change, huh? Well, I appreciate songwriters like Mike Cooley, whose work helps a lot of listeners, like me, do a little rewiring. Now, as we mentioned, Mike's Uncle Frank was inspired by stories his grandfather told him about communities affected by the Wilson Dam. And that dam holds back the Tennessee River along the line between Lauderdale and Colbert counties in Alabama. A man named Joshua Nicholas Wynne was interviewed for an oral history project about the TVA, which is housed at the National Archives in Atlanta. And in his interview, he shared his memories from when the Wilson Dam was being built. And he was a teenager at the time, living in Muscle Shoals.
We knew, from 1918 on, that the dam was being built, Wilson Dam. One of the slogans before the dam was built was "Dam the Tennessee." That's dam without the end. But we didn't want the Tennessee Dam because that would ruin our playground where we live. We, as children, thought it was progress with a little P because it was wrecking our whole life. See, when I left for college in 24, the water was coming up and water left my eyes.
For a couple of summers, Joshua worked for the TVA as a clerk in one of the warehouses. And he had vivid memories of seeing the water levels rise up.
On all of the trees, there was SOS. It looked like SOS. It was 505. Which was the water level where the new water line would be. And that was way up on the reservation. And I told my dad it looked like SOS to me, which is save, oh save, but it didn't work.
But as he got older, Joshua started seeing things differently. Only 4 years after the dam was complete, he was working as a school principal in Lauderdale County, Alabama, and not far from where he grew up.
I had the 7th, 8th, and 9th grades, 3 in one room. I had 12 classes a day, half an hour apiece. Well, guess what we used for illumination? Coal oil lamps.
But life in that area changed once the Wilson Dam brought electricity.
Now you can see the countryside is illuminated. We have the water system plus electricity, and it has bloomed and blossomed. Thank goodness for TVA.
Those comments from Joshua Nicholas Wynne were available thanks to the Tennessee Valley Authority's Oral History Program. Mr. Wynne himself died in 1997 at the age of 92. Just ahead, we've got more art inspired by the TVA and the stories of the communities that were lost when it came through. This is the Bitter Southerner podcast from Georgia Public Broadcasting. It's the Bitter Southerner podcast. Welcome back. On this episode, we're talking about the eternal tug of war between progress and preservation, a story that is writ large on the culture of the South because of how hydroelectricity changed the rural environment forever. We're right now in North Georgia at the Notley Dam, built and completed during World War II. And you're hearing the Notley River rushing up against the dam's rocky edge. Lisa Russell is a college English instructor, and she's written several books about lost towns in Georgia, including one called Underwater Ghost Towns of North Georgia.
That noise is freaky, like a lonely shore. You'd think it would be the ocean, but it's not. It's all man-made. It's those graves, those 84 graves that were left down there.
Now, as communities were about to be flooded by new dams, the TVA gave residents the chance to have the local grave sites moved. Beginning in 1933, nearly 70,000 graves across the region were investigated, and more than 20,000 graves were relocated. But Lisa says that she was surprised to find out how many graves were left untouched in the areas affected by the Notley Dam.
Notley is a very interesting one, all the different people that lived here. And what gets me, too, is the graves. You know, why did they not get all the graves? There's a little a cemetery called Butt. They had two people in there. The relatives who they could get a hold of said, I'll just leave them in place. There's like 8 cemeteries that they had to investigate. Right here, there was only 2 out of 86 graves. They could only find 2 families that wanted them moved. At 86. So what does that say? There's a lot of graves under that water.
And it's not just the grave sites. At Notley Dam and other dams across the Tennessee Valley, homes and businesses were lost. All the markers of the communities now gone are largely forgotten. They lie submerged. And Lisa says there's even arrowheads left behind by earlier inhabitants, the Cherokee Nation.
There's a lot of stuff lost, a lot of culture, a lot of history, a lot of archaeology lost. There's something about the past that gives us security for the future. You know, that the people that lived here, every day they got up and they, tried to make a living. And then when that living was gone, they figured out a way to make a new living. You know, it's the power of the human spirit, I guess. And that's why it's important.
Well, she's absolutely right, and our thanks to Lisa Russell for giving us a tour of Georgia's Notley Dam. When we visited her, we saw skiers and boaters all over the surface of the lake. A normal day on the lake, nothing unusual. But on that particular day, as we thought about all that's forgotten beneath the murky greenish water, seeing those skiers and fishermen felt absolutely surreal. The land that was sacrificed to create those lakes and to give the rural South electric power, all that weighed heavily on Bitter Southerner contributor Caleb Johnson when he was growing up in North Alabama, staring into bodies of water and wondering what was below.
I heard the myths and legends of catfish as big as Volkswagen Beetles and sunken towns and churches, with the steeple still standing and graves that weren't relocated. And, as a kid, it just fascinated me. I wanted nothing more than the lakes to dry up or the dams to be gone, so all the water was gone and I could walk around in that mud and ruin and see all these things that I'd grown up hearing were down there.
And that curiosity inspired Caleb's debut novel, Treeborn, which came out 2 years ago and tells the story of a fictional Alabama town that's soon to be flooded. The novel's main character, Janie Treeborn, refuses to leave. Caleb writes about that struggle and the history surrounding the property. Here's Caleb reading just a little bit of the opening.
The water was coming, but Janie Treeborn would not leave. She'd lived alone in this house, perched on the edge of a roadside peach orchard in Alberta, Alabama, ever since Lee Malone sold it to her. Sold, maybe not the right word, for the price she paid, the price he'd take. But it was hers, and she would not leave. Rather the water take her too. She'd been telling her visitor exactly how she came to own the house, which once was Lee's office, and before that his boyhood home. A complicated matter. To tell how this house and the surrounding property became hers, she needed to tell how it became Lee's. And to do that, she needed to first tell about a man named Mr. Prince.
That's beautiful. And
thank you.
One of the things that we want to do here, is explore not just the history of this thing, but how it has come to be a source of various works of art over the years, And I think it comes from something I've always noticed. There's this genuinely interesting sort of love-hate dialogue about the TVA when you talk to Southerners whose families were affected by the authorities' work. On the one hand, there's the knowledge that the TVA brought electricity across the rural South and thus helped usher it into the modern world. And then on the other hand is the fact that so many families lost their land and the homes they had had for generations, and the whole communities would disappear in a single day.
Yeah, Chuck, and if you read the history, there's this idea that giving up the land, and that's how it's framed oftentimes in the history, as giving up the land, was this sacrifice for a greater good. The TVA began and relocation of families was happening from around the Depression leading up to World War II, so a time when patriotism was rampant in parts of the country, and so there was this idea of sacrificing and it being a noble thing for some families in some communities to say, hey, we'll move, we'll leave this land here and go somewhere else and start over. And that's an idea that I think is a little bit of a myth that I never bought into. By the time I was growing up in the 80s, long after the TVA began, I grew up in a time when there was a really big real estate boom on some of these bodies of water. So I grew up seeing, these families moved, this land was sacrificed to create these bodies of water, to create this dam and bring this modernity to the South, but who has access to this water now? Who owns this land now? And when I looked around and when I tried to find places to go swim or walk or be out in nature, I realized it wasn't families like mine. It wasn't working class families, and I assumed it wasn't at the time, families who were largely asked to sacrifice that land in the first place.
Tell me again the name of the little town that you grew up in.
I grew up in Arley, Alabama. It's in Winston County.
And how far from the Wilson Dam is that?
Oh, you'd get in the car and go north about probably an hour, 45 minutes. You'd be in Muscle Shoals.
Okay. All right.
And I have a memory, or a lot of memories actually of being a kid, and when we'd go on vacation, if my parents had the time and the money, we would go to Gulf Shores, right? And that was a big vacation. But if they didn't have as much time or money in a given year, I remember we'd go up to the Shoals on vacation, for 2-3 nights, and we'd stay in this Ramada Inn right there where the highways come together just before you cross the river, and behind the Ramada Inn in the woods were walking trails, and the trails were sort of built through and around a former CCC encampment, and you could walk out onto the riverbank and along the Tennessee River, depending on the water level, and you walk up far enough, and looming in the distance, sure enough, there was the Wilson Dam. And so I grew up going to this place, and those are really vivid and happy memories for me, exploring the woods with my parents, finding the occasional arrowhead washed out of the riverbank there, and then in the distance seeing this, what to me was just a monumental machine or piece of construction in the distance, and it really loomed large in my imagination all those years since.
I think the first truly monumental structure I ever laid eyes on was Blue Ridge Dam, which was a Georgia Power lake, not a TVA lake. But I had the same reaction to it that you did.
Yeah, I mean, there's no where I'm from isn't even a town, Chuck. It's a rural community. There's no stoplight. There's no fast food to this day. It's a school, a one-story school, a couple gas stations, a couple restaurants, and a three-way stop, and that's it. So I certainly wasn't seeing, even two-story buildings, red brick buildings like you might see in a smaller town, a slightly more urban version of the South, and I surely wasn't seeing a skyscraper of any kind unless I went to Birmingham, which we did on occasion. But so to see a monumental structure like that in a rural setting, I think it is powerful, and it's mystifying, and it inspires awe, and so it's no wonder songwriters and novelists would want to write about it.
Well, as you've explored this topic over your life and then leading up to and into the writing of your first novel, Treeborn, what were some of the works of art and history that you found valuable to you?
A lot of it was family history. I did some reading of nonfiction books and scholarly and historical pieces in writing Treeborn, but really a lot of it for me was family history. It was sitting at the table with my grandmama and listening to her talk about exploring the hollers and hills and woods where we're from before the Sipsey River was ever backed up and Smith Lake created. It was listening to her tell stories about the dam being built and how fast the water rose or didn't rose, and people coming to watch the water rise. Ferries being built to cross the lake before the bridges were finished. It was just a time that, for whatever reason, I romanticized in a way, probably because I heard it talked about a lot. And when I started writing the novel, what really hooked me, because so much of Treeborn to me is about memory and how memories change, the more we handle them, how they can be faulty, they can be used to say something that you otherwise couldn't say. And what really kind of got me when I was working on Treeborn was I would listen to my grandmama tell these stories of before the dam, before the lake. And my mom would be sitting there too. And every once in a while, my grandmama maybe couldn't remember, or she'd pause or be struggling to recall something, and my mom would jump in and pick up the story with this memory or this, this moment, this story, as if it was hers. And she was born right when the dam was being finished, so she has no memories of this time at all, but she had heard these stories and memories be passed down so much, and she had absorbed the pictures, and the family history to where it was real to her. It was a memory, it had become a memory of hers as well, and that kind of notion fascinated me, and I wanted to explore it in book form.
Well, I read your book, and if you haven't read Treeborn, I don't want you to make the mistake of thinking that you would be reading a historical novel about the progress of the TVA, because Treeborn is something way, way different from that.
Yeah, it's a mythologized version of that history for sure. There are inaccuracies that are intentional. There are, supernatural elements introduced to kind of muddy the water of what's real and what's not real. And there are things taken straight from my family history, and there are seeds taken from my family history that I've altered. I wanted to do that because writers I admire have done similar things. The kind of touchstone I always go back to for this book is actually not a Southern writer, but a South American writer, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And so his novel, 100 Years of Solitude, was just such a touchstone for me as a reader and as a writer for Treeborn. The way he took his grandmother's stories from this small village near the coast of Colombia and created this fictional town of Macondo and the people in it, and all the tragedies and losses and celebrations and gifts that came to them along the way. I wanted to kind of do an Alabama version of that. And lately, Chuck, when people have asked me, when they find out I've written a novel and they say, oh, well, what's it about? As you know, having read it, Treeborn's kind of difficult to encapsulate in a few sentences. So what I've been saying lately when someone says, what's your novel about? I say it's a redneck version of 100 Years of Solitude. And I just leave it at that.
I love that. And, I pimped your book to a lot of people in a lot of different conversations since it came out. And they were like, okay, why do I have to read it? And I go, well, it's kind of like Gabriel Garcia Marquez set in the South. It's redneck magical realism in a way. It's like, I almost think that if the South had a film director comparable to Guillermo del Toro, this thing would already be in production as a movie.
Hey, that's high praise in my book, and I wish we did. I'm sure they're out there, this filmmaker. Maybe they're just not to the point where they can make one yet. So if they're listening, any aspiring filmmakers or working filmmakers, I would love it. That sounds like a great thing to me.
Spreading the art inspired by the Tennessee Valley Authority. Our thanks to Bitter Southerner contributor Caleb Johnson, author of the novel Treeborn. Y'all really need to read it. It's great writing. And if you're looking for Caleb these days, you'll find him in Boone, North Carolina, teaching writing to some lucky students at Appalachian State University. Now, Caleb learned about communities lost by TVA dams through his family's own stories. And that's also how one of our podcast listeners learned about that history. Royanne Baer lives in Jonesboro, Tennessee, and she says her mom grew up in Katawa, Kentucky. But that family had to move in the 1960s because of the development of TVA's Barkley Dam.
Parts of the town were moved from their original location in what is commonly referred to as Old Katawa to what is now referred to as New Katawa.
The family had a general store and home, and the home was ultimately relocated to a new part of town.
My grandmother had the house physically moved from Old Katawa to New Katawa. They chose what I guess would have been considered a prime site. It was the highest point in the new town.
Years later, Royanne says she and her mom would stop at the home's original location.
We would drive into Old Katawa, and we would always stop, and we could get out, and there were two trees that marked where they sat. She always said they sat in her front yard, and they were right at the edge of the water, and she would walk what little bit of the property she could, but most of their property was submerged.
Now, unlike some communities flooded by the TVA, parts of Katawa stayed the same.
They didn't have to move the cemetery. The cemetery sat up on the hill, and so it's still there in Old Katawa.
Now, as people left Old Katawa, even to resettle just a few miles away, the character of the original town was changed forever. Royanne says there's no question that the TVA improved the lives of so many people by expanding hydroelectricity. But for her, it is heartbreaking to think about all that the earlier generations, including her mom's, lost in the process.
Her childhood home is still standing. It's just not on the land that she ran around on as a child. It's not the land where she went out and caught lightning bugs. In my mind, one is someone who loves and appreciates history. Two is someone who's from the South, where I think as a people, we're really tied into our land. I cannot imagine what my mother and her sisters had to experience.
Now, our thanks to Royanne Baer, who now lives in Jonesboro, Tennessee, for sharing her family's story. And stories like that of the communities disrupted by the TVA live on in every Southern generation. They're in the stories we tell and in the art we make. And we've shared a lot of examples of both of those with you, but we got one more piece of art that we want to include. It's a moving song called Hazel Creek by the Nashville-based group Granville Automatic. Now, Hazel Creek was an actual North Carolina town that was submerged by flooding from the TVA's Fontana Dam. We asked the two members of Granville Automatic to tell us about their song, Hazel Creek.
Hello, my name is Vanessa Olivarez, and I'm half the band Granville Automatic. Granville Automatic as a band has a tendency to seek out stories that are very weighted in sadness. This was a story that definitely appealed to us because of the underlying theme of loss that's consistently there, people losing their homes and never being able to return.
Don't curse the winter time again. That's when the crows control the wilderness. And last year is when it all began, when woods rolled the lanterns in.
My name is Elizabeth Elkins. I'm part of the band Granville Automatic. When we go to research our songs, we often look for first-person stories from that time, and we really try to get inside one person's head and sort of make some guesses on the emotion. But this was a newspaper article that we came across about a woman whose dad just started drinking when they had to leave. And so there's moonshine in my father's eyes is a line in the chorus, and it just focuses on that moment of letting go of the town. And she's younger, she's moving on, but for her father, he can't move on.
Driving near those places and just knowing that there's something, it's like Atlantis, underneath it. It just makes me wonder about what was there and the little pieces of history that everyone experienced that live in the town and how that's just no longer. How do you erase an entire town? It's so weird.
And we left Sugar Fork, a little mining town. 2 sons lost to war, another never found. And electricity is gonna turn around your empty life and make it proud.
For me, there's a moment in the second verse where one of the stories we found in the newspaper was this woman had 2 brothers who had gone and fought in World War II. One came home, one didn't. And the fact that they were out fighting for the United States in the war, while at home their hometown was being destroyed, to basically provide power for Alcoa and for Oak Ridge, for them to go, one of them to give up their life. So this father loses his son and his hometown in both cases for the sake of American progress. So to me, that second verse is very compelling.
What was so appealing to me visually about the story was the thought about grave sites and how you pass them every day and you can see evidence of people that loved these people. And I think when I think about Hazel Creek and I think about these tiny towns where people can't go back and they can't lay flowers on their loved ones' graves, it makes me think about all of these graves left undecorated and how sad that must be.
North Shore Road. Oh, I remember 1944, and Mama's buried out by the old homestead. We can't go there again. No, we can't go back again.
Well, I hope people take away this idea that the visual is not the whole story. You see this beautiful lake, but people do. They go to jet ski and have fun and fish and hang out, and they're one of the most popular recreational things, especially in the South. And I think we take things for granted, like electricity, and we don't think of the impact that something that big had on so many people's lives. And it does resonate. I mean, I feel like the TVA, and it's a very big part of Southern life. And I have such a love-hate relationship with the entire concept.
Our thanks to Elizabeth Elkins and Vanessa Olivarez of Granville Automatic for taking us back in time to Hazel Creek, North Carolina. And we have one more bit of time traveling we need to do before we end this particular show. Months ago, when we first began building this episode, we hoped to find someone still alive who actually remembered losing their home to the TVA and who might be willing and able to talk to us. I called one of our contributors in the North Carolina mountains up by Lake Chatuge, Marianne Leake. I hoped that she might know someone or might know someone else who did. Marianne called me back soon to tell me that she had found a woman named Muriel Blankenship, who was 14 years old when her family was forced to leave the Elf community in Clay County, North Carolina. Now, after the TVA completed the Chatuge Dam in 1942, Lake Chatuge swallowed the Doyle family home. This is Marianne talking to Ms. Blankenship, who was 92 years old at the time last year.
Is it Muriel Doyle Blankenship?
That's right.
Okay.
And I married Joe Blankenship.
Married Joe Blankenship. Okay.
That has to be in there.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Now, Muriel Doyle was married to her late husband, Joe Blankenship, for nearly 60 years. The two got married shortly after graduating from high school, and at that point, it was only a few years beyond when Muriel left her childhood home in Elf. Muriel's son, one of Marianne's neighbors, had told her that his mama didn't even have one photograph of the home that she'd grown up in. But as you've already learned this episode, the TVA kept meticulous records. So we dug into those records and actually found a picture of the house snapped by a TVA field worker. Now listen as Ms. Blankenship sees her childhood home for the first time in nearly 80 years.
This is the house we lived in. It ain't hardly a house.
Can you tell me about this house?
The roof had cracks in it. If it snowed, some of the snow went through the cracks. That was a blessing, though.
Why was that a blessing?
Because there's a roof over our head.
That's true. That's
all we had.
Yeah.
If you didn't catch all that, Ms. Blankenship says that the roof had cracks in it that let the snow fall through. But she saw that as a blessing. Why? Because we had a roof over our heads. It's all we had.
How many rooms were in the home? Do you remember?
2 bedrooms. There's so many people rock go bed.
Muriel Doyle Blankenship had 8 siblings and a single mom, and they slept 4 to a bed.
Now that's the family. Let's see, Rosie, Viola, Virginia, me, and Vita.
In the months before the family's December 1941 relocation, a TVA representative visited Muriel's mother 7 times, the records tell us. Now, after his first home visit, he wrote that he did, quote, not know how this family manages to exist, close quote. Like other residents in the Tennessee Valley, they were ultimately forced to leave. The United States government paid the Doyle family $405 for their home.
They didn't give her, they just gave her the money. They just gave her a check for $400.
Yep. You're right. You're right.
According to the TVA records, the family was willing to cooperate in every way possible to move, but at the same time they were frightened at the prospect of the removal and the relocation. Ms. Blankenship told Marianne that their whole family was apprehensive about the unknown, but to the youngest children, it felt like something of an adventure. Ms. Blankenship told Marianne about the first time she took her siblings to the shores of the brand new Lake Chatuge. When Marianne asked her what she did when she got there, Muriel's answer came quick and fast. I jumped right in. Well, 2 months and 3 days after Marianne interviewed Muriel and showed her that picture, Miss Blankenship passed away. So we dedicate this episode with love to the memory of Ms. Muriel Doyle Blankenship. That's it for us today, y'all. Sean Powers produces all these shenanigans, and Josephine Bennett is our wise editor. If you want to read Marianne Leake's story about her visit with Muriel Blankenship, it's called When the TVA Came to Town, and there's a convenient link for it on our website in the show notes to this episode. That's where you can also get a link to Dangerous Waters, Micah Cash's photo essay on how the South was transformed by the TVA. And finally, we posted all the TVA songs we've been playing for you to a playlist, as well as links to PDF files of the TVA's complete records on Muriel Doyle's family and Maddie Randolph's family. Our thanks go out to the authors who appeared on this episode, Lisa Russell and Caleb Johnson. Our thanks go out to the voice actors, Jessica Gurrell, who played the part of Maddie Randolph, and John Weatherford, whose voice is no doubt familiar to our listeners in Atlanta. And thanks to the songwriters. First of all, Mike Cooley. Ever South, our theme song, was written by Patterson Hood and the band that he and Mike founded, the Drive-By Truckers. And to Elizabeth Elkins and Vanessa Olivarez of Granville Automatic for talking with us about their great song, Hazel Creek. We heard additional tracks from DeWolf Music. If you like the Bitter Southerner podcast, please review it and rate it on Apple Podcasts. Even if you listen to it somewhere else, those reviews on Apple Podcasts warm our hearts and they attract others to hear what we're talking about. Our show is a co-production of Georgia Public Broadcasting and the Bitter Southerner magazine. You can access more from each episode at gpb.org/podcast. I'm Chuck Reese, and my 3 instructions remain constant. Hug more necks, abide no hatred, and spend your time doing what you love with who you love. And if that's going to the lake, that's fine. Just give a minute to think about what might be underneath the surface. We'll see y'all in 2 weeks with our final episode of Season 2. It is a big one. Stay tuned.